The worlds of film and symphonic orchestra performance are colliding with increasing frequency nowadays. It seems that more and more orchestras are doing the kinds of presentations where they will show a classic movie and then an orchestra will play the score specifically written for that film. And so you get a live orchestra playing the soundtrack, which is quite a bit different from having it pre-recorded. I myself have had the great good fortune of doing such performances of Psycho, of Casablanca, and hardest of all, The Wizard of Oz. More about that another time, but very difficult score to conduct. And so I thought it was just about time for the Philharmonic to do one of these kinds of presentations. And so we're going to show an early silent film by René Clair called Entr'acte, so named because it actually bisected the two acts of a ballet called Relâche, with music by Erik Satie and scenario by Francis Picabia. The film is a delightful bit of absurdist, surrealist whimsy. Don't look for anything resembling a plot so much as a series of unrelated scenes, the longest of which has to do with a runaway hearse containing a coffin, containing a body that turns out not to be dead at the very end of the film. Oh God, spoilers, well, too late. Satie wrote a fascinating score for this film in that for whatever reason, my videographer Cal Lewin just reminded me that in those days such things as projector speeds might even have been variable. So for whatever reason, he wrote it in such a way that the score could be cut, added to, you cut out 4 bars, you add 8 bars. It's almost conceived in a series of blocks, which the conductor, sometimes I guess even on the fly, would adapt to the needs of the film. The very opening, for example, is this strange little march built on the following ostinato. And so on and so forth. Later on, there's a sort of a whimsical little waltz that accompanies the twirlings of a ballerina who is shot from a distance, who is shot from below on what must have been a plexiglass floor, and her music comes off something like this. These are all fascinating little fragments. It builds to a tremendous cacophony at the end as the out-of-control hearse speeds along, eventually discharging the coffin in a grand finale. Also, you must watch the first couple of minutes of the film very carefully because the two gentlemen who are musing over a cannon, trying to figure out the best way to insert its projectile so that it can be fired, are Erik Satie and Francis Picabia. So you'll have a chance to see the very dapper Erik Satie, complete with his black bowler hat, trying to figure out how to get this cannon to fire. Around the beginning of the 20th century, there was an increasing interest on the parts of some composers in folk music. Bartók and Kodály in Hungary, Vaughan Williams and Holst in England. And the Australian-born composer Percy Grainger, who started his career in Australia, eventually went to Europe, and after that lived the last 40 years of his life in White Plains, New York, was interested in folk music from all over the world. He was always doing settings of English folk songs, of Danish folk songs, of American folk songs. And we're opening our concert with a setting of a folk tune called Spoon River. And in the course of this very compact 4-minute piece, Grainger puts this one tune through a whole series of wonderful hoops. The tune goes like this. And that is really the entirety of the basic material on which the piece is based. The first time, the accompaniment couldn't be simpler. It's just a series of plucked and struck A's. Etc., etc. The second time, the harmony starts getting a little bit more fleshed out. And it builds and builds and builds. It goes into one of those incredible Grainger fantasy sections where the tune suddenly is barely audible in the background while the rest of the orchestra goes into this strange, almost surreal fantasy built on some very bizarre harmonies indeed. But no worries, it comes out in a very healthy blast of C major. One of the truly supreme conductors and musicians of the 20th century was a Greek-born gentleman named Dimitri Mitropoulos. Almost criminal that he's as relatively forgotten today as he is. There certainly are many recordings that one can hear on YouTube and on compact disc. He did the first commercial recording ever of the First Symphony of Mahler. And not that we take Mahler's First for granted today, but it's such a repertoire staple. To hear it played by an orchestra where you can almost feel them saying, "We're the first ones." It's an enchanting, magical performance that you really should hear if you love this symphony as much as I do. Early in his career, before his entire life was taken up with conducting, Mitropoulos did a bit of composing. And I found this beautiful symphonic poem that he wrote at the age of 19 called Taphi, the Greek word for burial. It's the composer's vision of the burial of Jesus Christ. It's really among the most beautiful funeral marches ever written for orchestra. I would put it up there with any of the funeral marches of Beethoven or Mahler. Please come and hear this extraordinary piece. You will not be disappointed, and you will make a profound new musical friend. The second half of our concert is going to combine music by Sibelius, two utterly unknown works for cello and orchestra, with Mara Finkelstein as soloist. And we're going to end with certainly the most famous work on the concert, The Pines of Rome by Ottorino Respighi, the second work in his so-called Roman trilogy. This was a work that created a little bit of a ruckus when it was first performed. One reason, very famously, is because of the fact that Respighi wanted to imitate a bird song at the end of the third movement. And at first he apparently thought of doing it with a coloratura soprano. That didn't quite work. He tried writing it for a couple of different instruments and their high registers, also didn't work. And so he finally hit upon the idea of having somebody actually play a record of a nightingale singing at the end of this movement. Nobody had ever heard of anything being done like this before, but to Respighi it made perfect sense. And now again, it's one of those things that's so much in our musical DNA that we take it very much for granted. I read somewhere that even more shocking than this was this bit of dissonance toward the end of the first movement, where the orchestra is playing this, it sounds essentially like an Italian nursery rhyme. But against that, we're essentially in A major. The trumpets are blasting this B flat. You know, it just doesn't belong there. I'm sure there were a lot of people at the premiere who just assumed that the trumpets were in the wrong place or playing on the wrong instrument, but no, it is correct. This whole first movement is supposed to be an imitation of children at play, probably playing soldier, and I'm assuming that one of them is going, "Charge!" And since most children are tone deaf, that was the result.